Perfect. So tonight's event, we're super excited to have Pam Costanzo, a lawyer and investigator with Roper Greyell LLP in Vancouver. So she's advised employers, employees, and unions in her 15 years of practice, and now primarily works with employers investigating allegations of bullying and harassment. In her non-work life, she enjoys hiking, reading, textile arts, and travel with her family. And as we've all, during the pandemic, as we've all started to be in these virtual spaces again and again, I find I'm really looking forward to the conversation that will happen tonight in terms of what we can do as designers, either participating in our virtual spaces, or if we have the opportunity to design those virtual spaces, to see what we can do to make things a lot more of a safer and welcoming and inclusive environment. So without further ado, I am going to hand that over to Pam, and she can introduce and start sharing.
Hi, thanks very much, Dave. And I just want to quickly say thank you to Dave and Naomi, who have really held my hand through this process. I was joking earlier that I have a lot of legal skills and very few technology skills, so they have been great. They have taught me everything from how to share my screen to we were trying breakout rooms earlier, which is something we're going to get to do tonight. So I am now going to share my screen. This will just take me a second. I think that worked.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So as Dave said, I'm a lawyer, and I work in labor and employment law. And over the last, I would say, 5 years or so, my practice has become very focused on issues of bullying and harassment and discrimination. It's a really interesting area to practice it, in part because I worked for many years on the union and plaintiff side, and I have more recently, in the last 3 years or so, moved over to working for employers. But I was actually at a women lawyers forum last night talking about issues of sexual harassment in the legal profession with a group of female lawyers. And it quickly became apparent that this is an issue on which I really feel it's less divided than a lot of labor and employment issues. I think everyone who was there from both union and plaintiff side and employer side was very united in the feeling that obviously these are issues that need to be addressed, and that as lawyers, it really behooves us to move our clients forward to creating more inclusive, diverse, bullying and harassment-free workspaces. And what I'm going to be talking about tonight is how that is starting to move into the more virtual world. And this is something, as you can imagine, as we've all moved more into working virtually, case law has started to come out about how these issues play out when people are working remotely or communicating through chat groups or accessing services online. And so I'm here to talk about some of the legal issues that come up. And I'm hoping you are here to help sort of each other think through how, as designers, you can use some of your skills and tools to deal with these issues before they arise. Okay, I'm there, yay, okay. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. It's a big topic. I've tried to narrow it down to a couple of specific examples, because diversity and inclusion is such a huge area. And as I said, we're going to be talking about the law to start with. Now, I want to start with this is sort of where we're going to end. But I wanted to put it in at the beginning because originally this was one of the last slides that I came to, but I thought actually, because we're going to be going into breakout rooms, and because people are going to be having largely unmoderated discussions about some fairly sensitive issues, I thought I would lead with this, which is maybe some ground rules for how to talk about these issues in a professional setting, which is what we're in tonight. And there was an article that came out from the Harvard Business Review in response to a controversy at a company called Basecamp, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later. And these are the principles that the authors recommended. A lot of workplaces are really struggling with how to talk about politics and JEDI issues. And sorry, everyone's coming to this from a different place of knowledge. So I threw an acronym in there. JEDI is Justice, Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion, which is sort of the buzzword that's being used in this area a lot right now. So what they talk about in this article is the idea of building empathy and respect, inviting diversity in leadership. We can practice that on a small scale tonight when you're dealing with people in your breakout rooms. Look around, look at the diversity that's around you, see which voices are there that might be voices that, may have some lived experience to contribute to the issues we're talking about. Accept mistakes from each other, because these are challenging conversations. I can't teach people how to disagree in an hour tonight and get through all this material, but hopefully we can talk to each other with respect when we're dealing with these issues. I also just want to say, one of the issues we're going to be talking about tonight is gender identity and expression. That's the first example we're going to kind of work through. Different people have different views on some of these issues, and tonight is not the place to air anybody's personal views about whether or not they want to respect others people's choices around gender identity and expression. We are taking that as a starting point, that respect and dignity is owed to everybody. And so if for whatever reason you are someone who does not feel comfortable starting from that point, I invite you to maybe watch and listen, but not participate in those discussions. So the big question that I'm going to be tackling, hopefully through some small examples, is how can you use design to promote and protect psychological safety in virtual spaces? That's a very big question. And so I'm going to be working through a couple of different examples when I talk about virtual spaces. One of them is accessing personal services online. We're going to be talking about the Human Rights Code, and services is one of the areas that the Human Rights Code governs, services and accommodation. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that. And we're going to be talking about online work and online work communication. And the example I'm going to be using there is Slack chat, because there's some new legal principles that have come out about that. So what I want to start with is, what are our legal obligations in these areas? So there's a couple of different, very formal statutes that set out legal obligations, rights and duties for everybody in British Columbia. And the first one is the Human Rights Code of British Columbia. You've probably heard it or heard about the Human Rights Tribunal, which is the body that adjudicates complaints under the code. The code, very simply, in very simple terms, prohibits discrimination when people engage in certain activities based on certain personal characteristics. So the activities that people are free to engage in without discrimination include employment, accommodation, services, and a couple of others that I'm not going to get into. And the personal characteristics that are protected from discrimination under the code when people engage in those activities are a very long list now. There's, I think, 17 or 18. They've added 2 new ones just recently. There's the ones that probably everybody's familiar with, which include race, gender, mental or physical disability, age, ethnicity. Also, gender identity and gender expression were added as protected grounds. So people have the legal right in British Columbia to engage in employment and other activities without being discriminated against in terms of how they express their gender. The newest ones that were just added this year are Indigenous identity and source of income. And I'm going to take questions at the end for sure, but I'm going to ask Dave if people are popping questions in the chat. Sorry, I should have said this earlier. Just wave your hand at me or something. I'm just going to keep talking. But if someone's confused about something, please say so. So I used this term earlier, psychological safety, and that's obviously, it's a common language. People probably have different understandings of what that means. But there is actually a case that came out very recently that talks in legal terms about what psychological safety means in the workplace, which is one of the areas that we're going to talk about tonight. This case really quickly, and it's not a case that dealt with virtual spaces, so I'm not going to get too far into the facts, but it dealt with a restaurant on the Sunshine Coast where they hired their first non-binary employee. When they were hired, they approached management and said, you know, my pronouns are they, them, and I would like everybody to use those pronouns. And there was the one employee who just was not on board with this. And he persisted in refusing to use the correct pronouns for this employee. And not only used the wrong pronouns, but used all kinds of sexist terms of endearment, such as sweetheart and honey, words that this employee kept saying were offensive and upsetting. The employee repeatedly approached management and said, I need you to address this. Management said, yes, we'll get to it, but later, so please be patient. Ultimately, this employee had a very emotional outburst at work. There was sort of a culminating event, and the employee, in fact, engaged in a minor assault. I think they slapped the other employee on the back. The employer, in response to this, terminated the employment of the non-binary employee, saying, well, we can't have people getting assaulted in the workplace. That is just not okay, right? So sorry, but we're going to have to end your employment. That person found a lawyer and filed a complaint at the Human Rights Tribunal. And the Human Rights Tribunal made some comments about how the workplace had become a place that was not psychologically safe for this server. And they made some statements that talked about the humiliation and the stress that people experience when they're at work, and they have to endure a discriminatory environment every day, but put up with it because they have to support themselves and feed their families. And there's that power dynamic that prevents them from being able to fully assert their rights in an employment relationship. They are trying to do their job and do their job well, but no matter how well they do their job, they are concerned that they are going to be judged because of their gender identity and how they express their gender, which is, you know, the basic point of the code is that people should not have to endure this. So in that case, the person got a nice large financial reward, and then restaurant got a lot of negative publicity in the media. So that's the first issue that I would like us to consider in terms of the context of design, gender design. And one of the things that a lot of workplaces are engaging now is questioning, how are we asking people to self-identify in workplaces? And I think it's a very interesting question about how we're asking people to self-identify in virtual spaces. A lot of workplaces are doing what's called gender audits now, where they look at all the places they collect gender information and ask themselves, when do we need this? You know, like I think we've all grown up filling in forms where you're confronted with this question. Are you male or female? Tick one. I booked a plane ticket recently where I was asked this question. And I was wondering, like, why would you possibly need to know my gender so I can go on a 2-hour flight within, you know, North America? There's a lot of times we ask and collect this information where it doesn't make a lot of sense. So the questions that I think we're all being asked to put to ourselves is, when do we need it? When do we not need it? And when we need it, how are we asking for it? And how are we collecting it? So one solution that some survey designers have come up with is, instead of showing people this, one or the other, and then Dave, when we were talking about this, pointed out that some places even now, you, instead of seeing male or female, you see male, female, other, which I think in my view is not a good solution. This is a solution called the two question. It's a dual question questionnaire. So for example, in healthcare, where sometimes you do need to know gendered information about people, questions are being presented in this form. What sex were you assigned at birth? And then there's a number of options, including one where you can fill in your own, or you can choose not to share the information. And then what is your current gender identity? And again, a number of options, fill in your own, prefer not to state. This is a much more respectful and inclusive way to collect gender information about people. But again, it should only really be happening when you need that information. So all of that to say, we are now going to, oh, whoops, sorry, I need to go back. How do I go back? I'm just gonna come out and go back here. There we go. This is the first group activity, and it arises from an article I was reading about Airbnb that deals with this issue. And I'm sure most of you have used Airbnb. I'm a big fan. I've been using Airbnb for many years. And when I go into my account, there's a number of reviews that people have posted about me. And these are very valuable because I try to be a good guest and they say nice things about me, and then hosts in other cities are more likely to rent me their accommodation. So there's actually a lot of value to me in these reviews, but they do contain a lot of information about my gender. It says in there that I'm married, there's photos of me. I use the pronouns she, her, and those pronouns are sprinkled through my host's reviews. And there's information about, my family. So what Airbnb confronted is if they have clients who are changing how they express their gender, or are even transitioning to a new gender or a different gender, they have clients who are saying, okay, well, now I'm in a situation where my what is referred to as a dead name, a name that I no longer call myself by, is part of those reviews. There's information on there that shows that I used to express myself with a different gender identity. And Airbnb had to ask the question, well, how do we deal with this? This obviously not only presents some issues of psychological safety for people, but may actually present physical safety issues for people. When you're dealing with Airbnb, you are going into people's homes, sometimes alone. And so they wanted to make sure that they could protect people's psychological and physical safety and how that information was stored and presented. What they do now is if customers make a request, there is a person that goes through that individual's history and manually changes all of the information from the past to match how that person currently presents. So what I'd like to do to start with our first exercise is to have you, as people who deal with online things, this is where I'm really out of my comfort zone. Consider, are there design solutions here? Airbnb solution, I think, is good as in many ways. It's obviously placing an onus on the clients to request this happen. And my question is there a design solution here that can, first of all, take some of the onus off the clients to have to come forward and say, I have changed my gender and I would like my review history changed. And second of all, perhaps make it easier. So Dave is going to put people in breakout rooms because we have determined that I am incapable of doing that.
All good. I got you covered. So yes, I'm going to, and I'm also going to post a 3 kind of, I don't know, just conversation starting questions as well. So we'll get into groups of 4. So I'm going to send you to all of the breakout rooms momentarily here, and I'll post those questions in the channel. And I think we agreed on 7 minutes, Pam.
Yeah, that'll take us to 6:30. That cool. Seems good.
And so, yeah, there's going to be 3 groups of 4. So yeah, in each group, kind of nominate a spokesperson. And yeah, because we'll have our 3, we'll be able to have at least a summary of what you discussed, and we'll have time to share from each group. So I will get that started right now.
So my takeaway is that 7 minutes was not enough time for that particular question. So I'm wondering if anyone wants to unmute themselves and share anything that came up in that room. I would like to share first one thing that I thought was interesting. I think it was Naomi said, perhaps one way to change things is to have where you're renting your entire place, the default is you don't collect information about gender. Where you're renting a shared space, you can set some preferences because there's personal safety issues. I think in some cases, would anyone else like to jump in and share anything?
Hi there. Yeah, it was a really interesting discussion and case study. I think, I mean, I think we were brainstorming different ideas, so we didn't have any consensus on one. But I think that I'm not. I think we weren't clear on whether the reviews were both sort of free form and then also maybe a structured rating, sort of like on particular criteria, like courteous and paid on time or things like that. Whereas the structured ratings, they don't need to refer, they don't have to use any pronouns because it does refer to the guest or guests. Whereas the 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 open comment, I think just with English, it's just natural to be able to describe, you know, people, and you just naturally do use pronouns. You could, as a design, sort of replace those pronouns with just, you know, guest, or one, you could encourage the reviewer to use those and not use gender pronouns, or maybe you could automatically sort of swap those out. So there's definitely a lot of design decisions there in terms of making it easy for the reviewer to write something and be expressive enough, but the output finally is not, doesn't have those pronouns or has an easy way for things to be changed.
Yeah, that's a really great thought that had not occurred to me to mention, that these are sort of just people writing things. There are criteria where you go through and rate people, you know, on a scale of 1 to 5 on different criteria, but a lot of it is just these comments. And if you did away with those and just asked for sort of ratings on very set relevant criteria, I think you could solve that problem right away. Yeah. So because our time is limited, I'm sorry, I am going to move along in the now I've stopped sharing my screen, so I am going to do that again. Okay. So the next topic I want to talk about is harassment, which again, very big topic, obviously. We could talk for hours about it. There's a lot of law on what harassment is. And right before I joined this session, I was writing one of my investigation reports, and every report I write has a section that kind of goes through these definitions for people. So I can kind of recite them in my sleep. But basically there's 3 ways harassment can come into the workplace. And I am going to talk about an employment context in this section. One is through human rights law. So under the code, discrimination on the basis of, for example, sex or race would encompass conduct that is harassing. Under workers' compensation law, people can get compensated for psychological injuries that they incur at work. And one of the ways people incur psychological injuries at work is by being harassed. So the workers' compensation has a well-developed policy on what harassment and bullying is, and they have a lot of legal requirements that workplaces have to follow to do their due diligence to ensure that their workplaces are free of bullying and harassment. These are some legal definitions. I often think, as much as I need to work with these, a lot of people know it when they see it. And a lot of times it comes down to that gut feeling. There was a young woman last night who was talking about the experience when we were talking about sexual harassment, the experience of going through something where you're like, this just feels wrong. And I think sometimes that, that can be enough for people to start questioning whether some of these lines are being crossed, is when things just feel wrong and boundaries are being violated. Now, companies, employers have to have policies. That's one of the requirements of workers' compensation law, is that every employer has to have policies on bullying and harassment, and they have to train their employees on them regularly. There are things that are not harassment. I just want to quickly move those out of the way because they come up. You can manage people, you can engage in performance management, you can have differences of opinion in the workplace, you can be a crappy manager. Those are not harassing actions or conduct. So these are things that are uncomfortable and unpleasant, but they're not actually in breach of the law. So one of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit tonight, because it involves a tech company, it was a controversy that was in the media in regards to the company Basecamp. And I did some reading about this. I have no personal involvement in it. Obviously, I can't talk about anything that involves clients. So this seemed like the perfect example because I've never done anything to do with this company. This is a situation where internally, they started to have those conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the CEO publicly acknowledged that the company had a weak record on diversity. And this was a company that had publicly, taken a lot of very political and liberal positions. But some employees started to get a little more, I guess you could say, activist around this issue. And one of the things that came up that sparked a lot of the conflict that happened at this company was that it came out that for quite a number of years, some customer service people had been keeping a list, a sort of secret list that was shared by quite a few people, of funny customer names. And I'm sure you can guess that quite a few of these names were names that were not, Anglo-Saxon Protestant names. So obviously, employees of color and employees from other ethnic backgrounds found this quite offensive. And there was some conversations happening internally about DEI when things got a little bit heated, and the CEOs of the company said, "That's it, we're shutting this down." And they actually said, we're not going to have this council, and we're not going to talk about this stuff anymore. And you are no longer allowed to talk about politics at work. They just completely, they decided to address the conflict inherent in talking about these issues at work and the discomfort and conflict that can arise from that by saying, you're not allowed to talk about it anymore. And unfortunately, that was not the best approach. And what ended up happening is a whole bunch of people resigned. Now, this is a quote from the CEO writing about this, and he said, every discussion remotely related to politics, advocacy, or society at large quickly spins away from pleasant. That is probably true. But having uncomfortable conversations is something that I think is really important in workplaces right now. It's something that a lot of law firms are trying to engage in with mixed success, and a lot of my clients are trying to engage in with mixed success, but it's something that has obviously become essential to a lot of workers to be able to, as I talked about earlier, come to work, feel psychologically safe. And a part of that is being able to bring their whole selves to work and not having to deny that. So not having to come to work and pretend that they aren't dealing with experiences of racism or they aren't dealing with experiences of sexism. So I would like to say that this was sort of the what not to do example. The slide that I put up at the beginning about the article from the Harvard Business Review talking about principles for respect, invite diversity in leadership, practice empathy, accept mistakes. was written in response to this controversy that happened. One of the places that some of these conversations are happening is on Slack. And there was recently a legal decision that came out about such a conversation at a BC company on a Slack channel. So this company had a dedicated Slack channel for non-work topics, which I think is fairly common, and which as a lawyer just gives me hives. I hate this idea because Slack is very hard to monitor. And in this case, a debate about gender equality between two employees that happened on this channel got a little out of hand. And just briefly, I will say that it was an employee who took great offense at people raising issues of discrimination on the Slack channel and reacted by sending out an email to every single person in the company, basically saying, people in this company are discriminating against men, and this is unfair. And because people on the Slack channel were talking about experiences of sexism, that resulted in 2 legal claims, one by a female employee who said that the conversation on the Slack channel had caused her psychological injury, that she had been, I guess, mildly traumatized by some of the comments that were made. And then, unfortunately, one of the employees reacted to these rather insensitive comments by engaging in a little mild poisoning of this male employee and putting some medication in his water bottle. So he then also filed a claim against her. So she filed a claim, he filed a claim. This is why lawyers are not the best people to deal with these issues sometimes, because what ended up happening was it spun off into a multi-year journey through the courts about where jurisdiction lay over these legal issues. Is it in the courts, or is it with the Workers' Compensation Tribunal? Is it a work-related injury if you're on a non-work-related Slack channel having a debate about sexual discrimination? The conclusion of it all is that the legal finding is that it's just like water cooler chat and it's compensable. This is work-related, and you can claim workers' compensation for psychological injury that's incurred in the course of harassment on a Slack channel. That took many years to get to. The legal takeaway of that case was, gee, employers really need to have policies that deal with online communication and harassment. I personally don't think a policy would have resolved any of these issues. This is where you are coming to issues of workplace culture and not a lack of a policy on a piece of paper. So that's bringing us to our second exercise, which is it possible to design online chat systems that address harassment? Now, I have some information here. I have to admit, I have never used Slack in my life. Law firms don't have this stuff. which should tell you something, right? We don't like this kind of thing. But I know my kids have used it at work, and it's obviously a very common platform, so it's not going away. But this is what I have learned about Slack through my reading, which is that through their new messaging platform that they rolled out last year, you can have a Slack email address that allows you to send invitations to people, and basically people can start to get messages that they have no control over. Like, there's really no way to opt out of this stuff. People can't usually choose not to use Slack in their workplace. I know, for example, my daughter worked in a place where that was how you got your schedule for work. She works in a restaurant, and so she couldn't choose not to be on there. Is there a better way to design these sorts of chat systems as opposed to just kind of having it as a free-for-all, where things very quickly can spin out of hand, and management isn't watching, right? It's not like when you're standing in the middle of an office, there's not always ears and eyes on what's going on. Is there a better way to design it to try to address some of these issues and concerns that people have raised? Particularly given now as employers, if any of you employers out there you are on the hook if people are getting traumatized by what's happening. So more breakout rooms, please, Dave. So thanks for that. We are coming up to 7 o'clock. I'm wondering if anyone has any comments or questions they want to finish with, and I'm happy to take questions, or we can hear comments as a group, whatever works for people.
We were having a good conversation about moderation and different types of features and functionality and different levels and that sort of thing. I don't know if Anthony, you wanted to talk us through kind of that perspective.
Yeah, I just brought up a couple of things around. Well, and I think Cole was kind of mentioning, there's kind of different ways that people could flag messages. If you had somebody who was a moderator, they could get a sense of whether there's a conversation that's kind of heating up, and try and sort of intervene before things boil over. I mean, basically human moderation has been a tool that's been used on most online forums, and usually they get to a point where it gets big and it no longer becomes self-moderated, and you need somebody to come in and start enforcing some rules and enforcing some sort of standards. So there's kind of different levels of moderation that you could do, and it could be sort of assisted with other people kind of flagging things if things are out of control. But I think one of the things that we all talked about as well is just how much a tool like Slack is just absolutely indispensable to the way we work, and especially when we're not co-located, but even when we are co-located, and how much culture happens, how much team building happens, how much all kinds of really good things happen. And yeah, absolutely, you create a tool and people will find a way to, bully people and bash them over the head with some ways, but it's just so valuable. I would find it really hard if somebody joined my team and didn't want to use Slack. I would be like, well, we're going to email you every time we need to talk to you? Like, it's
that's what lawyers do.
How?
I'm on email all day long.
Yeah.
And then we have document management systems for our email. It's bonkers. It does create a whole host of other problems, but we have a lot more eyes on, like everyone in the firm can look at every single email that I send and receive on our work email, just because of the way it's stored and shared. Yeah. So there's very little scope for shenanigans when you have that. So it's 7:02. Does anyone have any burning questions they want to ask about the law? I'm sitting here, or are people ready to go and sit on a patio because the sun is out? I don't know.
I have a really quick question, but y'all don't feel like you need to stay for it. It's about kind of changes to the law. So for example, Indigenous identity that you've mentioned a couple of times. I'm curious, have you worked with an employer, or do you have a use case or example of when these changes were rolled out, like really empathetically and proactively within a company?
Sorry, when the changes were rolled out. So these changes get rolled out in the law, right? Like they actually, the legislature rewrites the code, and then nobody really knows about it except lawyers that spend time actually reading these websites. And then we all email each other and say, oh, look, they added Indigenous identity. And then we get in touch with our clients and say, you need to rewrite your policies. And then it takes a really long time for actual cases. Sorry, you may be using the word case in a different sense than I use the word case, but because, for example, you may not all know this, but the Human Rights Tribunal right now is so backlogged because of stupid sorry, I edited myself inside voice, mass complaints, that it's now a year from filing a complaint to the complaint being served on the respondent. So not a year to get a resolution to the complaint. It's a year before people even find out a complaint has been filed because they are so backlogged with screening. So actual cases related to these new human rights codes amendments are going to take a really long time to come forward.
Wow.
I don't know if that answered your question.
Kind of. Yeah, that makes sense because, yeah, you would need the examples. Yeah, I was wondering about employers who had kind of received the change or being informed about the change and kind of rolled it out to employees. If you've seen any of that done well, because I imagine like with gender identity, we have to speak a different language. Like we should speak a different language, and we should be like really hyper aware of that. Yeah.
I personally am finding, because I do talks and training in this area, and I'm sure it won't come as a shock to anybody that, and I'm going to make a gross generalization here, as a white person in her 50s, other white people in their 50s are a whole lot less on board with some of this stuff than people in their 20s and 30s. And when I look at, for example, I have an 18-year-old, almost 19-year-old daughter and her friends, they are all over this, like the gender identity and expression stuff. It's the air they breathe. And I am constantly getting corrected. So we have a lot of tolerance for mistakes in my house. But I talked to a group of insurance people a couple months ago about this stuff. And I had a guy just say like, I'm not ready. I'm just not ready. I was like, it doesn't really matter if you're ready. Like, that ship has sailed. It's the law now.
Thank you.
Awesome. I think Cole has his hand up.
Hi. Quick question, or maybe as you mentioned, there's a lot of cases happening or complaint-wise. So, have you noticed companies doing activities that kind of try to limit the liabilities for these human rights and within the companies? Let's say if you join a non-work related Slack channel, then the company is not liable for any discrimination happening on that channel. So is that the case that most of the companies take to kind of limit their liabilities, or it's just your opinion on that and how the big employers are tackling these issues and the rise of that?
So one thing I referred to recently is under workers' compensation law, employers have certain things they have to do. And one of them is you have to have a policy. And another one is you have to do training on the policy. So if someone was to file a claim, for example, saying that they had incurred a psychological injury due to harassment in the workplace, workers' comp is going to come in and they're going to ask you for your policy, and they're going to ask you for your training records, and they're going to ask you for your investigation logs, because the other thing you have to do is as soon as someone comes forward with a concern, you have to investigate it like that. And so that's my bread and butter, is there's a legal obligation to investigate complaints that could amount to bullying and harassment in the workplace. So big companies and even small organizations that I've worked with will put policies in place. And I think what is interesting to me is how you can get creative with the training. And instead of just putting people in a room and saying, here's the policy and we're going to read it together, which is just like, it's just deathly, right? Is to actually have training that talks about what kind of culture you want in your company, and like what are the ground rules for, because I think most places, I mean, sometimes I wonder, honestly, with some of the stuff I see, but most places, no, you can't trade sexual favors for promotions anymore. Like, you don't need to watch videos about how that's not good. But then there's conversations that I think are more interesting, like, how do you date in the workplace, right? Like, how do you date someone who works for you? People want to know that stuff, and it's really complicated. How do you have conversations about the fact that all of our leaders in this organization are white? How do we talk about that? What do we do about it? So that's more the kinds of issues that I think are interesting, and I hope more. I do think more companies are starting to look at that.
Thanks, Pam.
Cool. And I think we have Rock has his hand up.
Hi, Pam. I think in a way you answered my question already. I think we're, as designers, we try to think about how we design for a variety of people, for people with different experiences, backgrounds, things like that. And one interesting bit that you brought up was just that people from different generations might have a different worldviews on how much they buy into sort of, just like various ways of providing psychological safety. And I guess my question was, but I think you partially answered it. But I'd love to hear more if you had more thoughts on it. Is just, how have you seen it work, like a company handle that diversity of viewpoints? I'm hearing that there's different approaches. There's law. There's making a legal complaint. There's also HR. There's training. There's education. You've even talked about conversations, which may be a bit more interactive and a bit more of an engaging way of handling that. So yeah, any more thoughts on how companies, like what you've seen has worked well in terms of handling just the diverse worldviews? Because I think we need to acknowledge that, and then that's okay.
It's so hard. And I was feeling so discouraged last night, honestly, after going to this forum last night about sexual harassment in law firms, because people from all sides ultimately said, if you're someone in a workplace, like I'll start from that place. If you're someone in a workplace who is in a position of less power, and you are from a group that, is you're a racialized employee, or you're a young woman, or you're disabled, or, there's reasons you have less power in your workplace. Finding allies is really important. I think if you have people in your company who are being disrespectful, who are treating you in a discriminatory fashion, who are engaging in like what we refer to now as microaggressions, which is starting to get more traction in as a cause of action, which I think is really interesting. But one lawyer suggested that the best thing that's going to happen is that eventually all of the old white men are going to die and workplaces will get better. And I just like, really, do we have to go there? But sometimes it feels that way, honestly. Like I am so busy right now with files where people are behaving badly, and I see the legal solutions, for example, like the delays that we're seeing and the expense that you have to deal with. And I think my positive takeaway right now is there's a labor shortage, and young workers are in demand, and they have different expectations than I did, for example, when I started out in the workplace. And what I was willing to put up with, a lot of young workers are not willing to put up with now, if they are in a privileged position of being like a knowledge worker, a lawyer, a tech worker, someone like that who has some negotiating ability, right? So I don't know if that's a very positive response, but honestly, I don't know that there's a lot you can do with people who are resistant to treating their coworkers respectfully. Like I don't really believe anymore that a lot of education is going to solve that problem. I think ultimately those people may act badly and they may get fired, because that happens a lot now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks so much, man. Thanks for a great talk.
Thanks. On that note, so I'm at a firm called Roper Greyell. I'm on the web. Feel free to reach out. Email, call me. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. I work with lots of great colleagues who also work in this area. So thank you so much for coming on this very sunny evening. I appreciate you spending time on this.
And I'll send any details you want to share, Pam, just to a message to everyone who attended the event, just so they know where to reach you, so you don't have to remember the firm name or all that. We'll have that all sent. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Appreciate it. And really important issues.
Thanks for taking the time, Pam.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, good night.
Good night.